Hi guys. Today I'm going to make a little pause in the series I started to record about the French Revolution and tell you about the history of witchcraft. As usual, this video is made for your education, but also your relaxation and hopefully your ASMR tingles. So please relax, maybe close your eyes, and I recommend using headphones to better enjoy the experience. Like for my other videos, I'm going to tell you about it essentially from a social and historical point of view. I have what some could call a bias here. It is that I don't believe in witchcraft. I totally respect anyone's beliefs, and I'm not going to try to laugh at it, but personally I just don't buy the idea that there would be supernatural forces that some people would be able to use to manipulate. So I will stick with a more factual approach. At least this is how I see it, and talk about it essentially from this historical angle. In fact, I had the idea because I read the other day an article about these stories of people in Africa being accused of witchcraft and sometimes lynched by the crowd. This is something that is not very common, but it happens, and that made me realize to what extent the image, the public image of witchcraft could be different in the Western world, where in fact witchcraft is no more taken seriously. It is accepted like some sort of occult science. There is even a religion, the Wicca, claiming that they continue a long tradition of witchcraft, but generally the image of witchcraft is one that is very benign. Most of the population stopped believing in witchcraft since the 18th and 19th centuries, and the nasty image of witches persisted, for example in tales for children through the 18th and 19th centuries. But nowadays the average witch in movies or TV shows is more likely to be a very good-looking young woman, and the spectators are generally invited to identify themselves to the witches. They are not opponents anymore. Witches in novels, movies, or TV shows are generally facing misunderstanding from the rest of the population. They are like a metaphor, but one that has been used so much that it is becoming a bit cheap now, of minorities that are misunderstood and stigmatized by the rest of the population in order to show how ignorance can lead to hatred and the bad treatment of minorities. There are also often characters that the spectators could identify with, and it shouldn't come as a surprise that these kind of stories or shows are particularly popular with teenagers. This is a period when they are looking for their identity. they dream of having something special, and this appeal for the occult, for the belief that there would be supernatural forces that they could eventually understand and control, that would distinguish themselves from the others, is something very understandable. But this has nothing to see with what witchcraft was in the past, or still remains in other parts of the world, like in Africa or the Middle East and parts of Asia. And this is what I would like to talk about today. It is not that easy to define what witchcraft is. First, because from one culture to another, it takes very different forms of beliefs, and second, because there is something always subversive in the definition of witchcraft. If we just define it by magic, or the use of supernatural forces, we immediately see that most of the religions, maybe all of them, officially believe in magic and the possibility of supernatural events, but we don't call the miracles performed by saints in Christianity, for example, we don't call them witchcraft. Witchcraft has to be outside the institutions. It has like a negative definition. It is the use of magic outside generally admitted beliefs, which by definition gives witchcraft a particular subversive meaning. So it does not come as a surprise that in history many believers in minority or alternative religions have been called witches and hunted for that. If you want my opinion, this probably explains a lot of the appeal of witchcraft in the Western world today. Some people want to identify with these persecuted minorities. They are looking for this sensation of belonging to a small group that was stigmatized in the past for its specificity. So, historically, the first written examples of such beliefs date back from Babylonia and ancient Egypt, more than 1 millennium before Christ, even though we can suppose that belief in witchcraft is probably much older than that, and maybe came with the vast majority of human societies in history. And the practices that were called witchcraft were generally the capacity to influence somebody's mind or body by practicing rituals. Generally, the practices attributed to witches are the capacity to cast spells, and casting a spell can be made with very different methods, such as just saying words or writing runes or a text, or using enchanted objects, amulets for example, or even preparing potions with special ingredients. Witches were also sometimes attributed the capacity to communicate with the dead, to conjure the dead, in order to use them in the world of the living, or for divination, or to make prophecies. There are extremely different traditions when it comes to witchcraft between the regions of the world, and in particular the one we know in the Western world is the tradition that appeared in the first centuries of our era, in the early Middle Age, and then evolved over time. It is supposed that probably this belief in the modern form of witchcraft appeared with the Christianization of Europe. It is supposed that when Christianism spread to whole of Europe in the first centuries of our era, the older religions that the Christians called pagans in general survived in some places, especially in remote areas, and the believers, or what remained of them, were called witches because they increasingly appeared like outsiders in this newly Christianized world. And in fact, there is this image of witch hunts in the Middle Age that does not really correspond to reality. The belief in witchcraft was well spread in the Middle Age in all of Europe, but the Church in general, even though it condemned heresy and paganism in general, did not organize any hunts or any particular measure against these people. The official position was that belief in witchcraft was just a heresy, that there was no such thing as witchcraft, and that for this reason these people could not really be dangerous. The belief in a real danger is something that would come at a later stage, only in the 14th and 15th centuries. There are also many examples in the Middle Age of the population tolerating these practices and giving a particular social position to people supposed to practice magic. For example, in England, there was this position of the witch doctor, something very common in England in the Middle Age. People claiming they could heal others through their magic practices and their knowledge of medicinal plants. But this evolved, as I said, in the late Middle Age, with the first witch hunts starting in the south of France and in Switzerland in the 14th century. Maybe because the times were particularly hard. In the case of France, that was during the 100 Years' War. Also because the Great Plague spread to all of Europe. I talked about that in the video about the 100 Years' War, and killed about 1/3 of the European population. Maybe also because Christianity was extremely well established in this time, so the religious minorities were becoming even more visible than before. But whatever the reasons, this is the moment when we have the first records of crowds persecuting people and sometimes killing them for their alleged practice of witchcraft. In fact, this would take a much larger dimension during the Renaissance. It is sometimes believed that the witch hunts are a feature, a specificity of the Middle Age, but they are not. It's more during the modern period, starting in the 16th and 17th century, that we have the most witch hunts and obsession, almost a psychosis in Western European populations about witches. This is also the moment when the modern image of the witch really took shape, and most of the time witches were women. This is also something very specific to the Christian world. Some scholars see it as a consequence of the stigmatization of women in the Christian tradition, because in fact this is not something obvious in the rest of the world. In Africa, for example, it is most of the time men that are blamed for being witches. So the Western tradition has this very particular aspect of being extremely focused, oriented against women. The spread of Protestantism too apparently contributed to this obsession for witch hunts. For example, this belief that witches were women signing a pact with the devil is something specific to the Protestant tradition, and one sociological explanation to this hysteria about witch hunts in the modern period, in the 16th and 17th centuries, can be attributed to the need to find scapegoats in societies that needed an explanation or someone to blame to maintain the cohesion of the group. I will probably record another video about the history of this concept of the scapegoat, because that's something very interesting too. But in that particular case, it seems that witches in this period became the obvious, the natural scapegoats in European societies. And this culture, this obsession, was transferred to North America with the colonization of this region by Europeans, leading to one of the most famous examples of witch hunts and witch trials in history, which is the Salem witch trial. Maybe one deeper explanation to this hysteria with witches in the modern period comes from a feeling in all of Christianity, Catholics and Protestants alike, even Orthodox churches, that they were threatened. It looks very paradoxical, in fact, because this is the period when the Europeans were exploring and colonizing the world. So Christianity benefited a lot from that and spread to new regions of the world. It was also a time when the development of Islam was stopped. The Christians managed to drive Muslims out of Spain. They managed to stop the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. But despite this, there was this feeling of being threatened, maybe because the world was changing much faster than before with these explorations, and certainties that had been in force for several centuries were being questioned. Maybe also because the Christianity was strongly divided with the rise of Protestantism, but this might have explained why, paradoxically, there was this fear of facing an internal threat under the form of witches that could call occult powers and threaten the social order. So that it would take about 3 centuries until the beginning of the 18th century before this hysteria with witches started to decline. There is also an abundant folklore about the Catholic Church or people at the head of Protestant communities contributing actively to witch hunts. This happened sometimes, but it seems that it is essentially the population itself, like urban legends spread within the population, that explained this obsession with witches. The organized religions were more following the move. I told you, for example, that the Catholic Church to some extent ignored witchcraft until the end of the Middle Age. Then it started to embrace the fight against witchcraft, but it was very rarely at the head of the move, and it was also one of the first institutions to come back to reason in the 18th century and condemn the witch hunts, coming back to the position it had at the beginning of the Middle Age, saying that witchcraft just did not exist, and that people called witches were just heretics or mad persons, but that in any case they did not need to be hunted and killed. The most spectacular witch trials, such as the Salem one, which took place in the last decade of the 17th century. This is quite late in history, are generally attributed to mass hysteria, a phenomenon of collective madness due to isolation, due to social repression in these small communities. And in fact, this extreme example of mass hysteria and witch hunt may have been more influential itself than the belief in witchcraft, in the impact it had on mentalities and political values. The Salem witch trial is often referred as an example of what religious extremism, isolation, the absence of a well-established and respected process for trials can generate in terms of atrocities and unfair decisions. And it is more remembered today as an illustration of intolerance and hysteria than a true manifestation of witchcraft. By the way, if you are in Massachusetts one day, I highly recommend spending a couple of days in Salem because it is a very pleasant city today. You can visit a very good art museum. Can't remember its name, but it is worth a visit. And you also have several museums of witchcraft, which I personally don't take very seriously, but that can be fun. And on the top of that, you can eat excellent lobster. But anyway, returning to our story, I said that this belief and this hysteria about witchcraft declined in the 18th century as rationalism was gaining ground in philosophy, and the general level of education in the population was rising, and this took a brand new dimension in the 19th century, which is a century when rationalism, the belief in science and in positivism, progress, would become a dominant view of the world. Of course, witchcraft in the 19th century was increasingly seen as an old belief that was doomed to disappear. But in fact, instead of disappearing completely, it became socially acceptable, including in the high society, where there was like a taste for spiritism, for occult sciences. We cannot really say whether this was taken so seriously by this population in general, but it existed, and maybe that's just an interpretation. It can be read as a sort of reaction, a need to believe in the supernatural in a world that was becoming disenchanted by science and technical progress. This continued in the 20th century. It even led to the appearing or the reappearing, depending on versions, of this Wicca religion I was mentioning at the beginning, that emerged or was recreated as a reference to very old witchcraft practices that would have taken place in England or in Great Britain in general long before the Middle Age. And from the 80s, but maybe even more importantly the 1990s, the image of the witch changed radically, be it in US or in the US or in Europe. There is a minority in the population that believes in witchcraft and practices magic rituals. It is quite common to find specialized bookshops or shops that sell magic artifacts in the Western world today. And in the media, from the 60s and the 70s, very benign depictions of witches started to appear. As I said at the beginning, the image of the malicious witch continued to exist, especially in tales, in children literature in general, as the personification of evil. In many fairy tales, the opponent to the hero is a witch, but this was not taken seriously by adults. And in the 60s and 70s, you had a TV show like Bewitched, quite famous, that appeared, and this accelerated a lot by the end of the 80s and the 1990s with novels, especially written for teenagers and young adults, adaptations in films. An example of that I remember is a movie that was quite successful in the 90s called The Craft, the typical story of teenage girls that discover they have magic powers and use them. And the number of TV shows based on witchcraft grew dramatically in the past few years. There was like a couple of ones in the 90s, like Charmed, for example. In the recent period, it seems to me that there is a witch show or two every year appearing on television. But even though this image of witchcraft has now come to something fairly innocent in Europe, in the US, and to a large extent in various Asian countries too, I didn't speak much about witches' traditions in Japan or in China, because I know less about them and they are quite different. But there are still parts of the world where witchcraft is taken seriously by a large portion of the population. This is the case in Africa, as I said at the beginning, and sometimes with dramatic consequences. People die accused of witchcraft, generally with very filthy evidence. And you also have the case of Saudi Arabia, where in the past few years a few persons were executed on charges of practicing witchcraft. So this is not as fun as it may seem when we are looking at entertaining movies or TV shows. This is going to be all for today. I hope you found it interesting, and as usual, your comments and requests for other topics are very welcome in the commentaries below. Goodbye.